We live in a media-saturated environment in which data and misinformation now overwhelms us on a daily basis. Keeping the mind sharp, live, aware, and practice is very difficult and a great challenge. And it's part of why I encourage students to read, because it creates a counter environment in which they can continue to develop that sensibility and awareness.
Welcome to Education Matters. Today's episode is the first in a new sub-series I'm calling Big Ideas. Conversations with scholars, scientists, philosophers, and writers whose thinking challenges us to slow down, ask deeper questions, and resist the pull of our fast and reactive culture. In a time when certainty is everywhere and everyone has hot takes, this series is about returning to depth, to guests who make you think. Really think. My hope is that their examples encourage you to explore the limits of your own understanding, to revisit long-held assumptions, and to open new paths to insight, or at the very least, to continue to ask better questions. So I'm delighted to begin this series with a discussion with B.W. Powe, because I wanted to start with someone who's had a profound influence on my own life and thinking. BW was my professor 22 years ago when I was a young undergraduate student trying to make sense of the body of Western literature and philosophy and the increasingly complex world around me. BW didn't just pass on knowledge. He showed me and the rest of the class that thinking was not just an academic exercise, but a way of being in the world. That teaching was not transmission, but a revelation for the here and now. And it really didn't hurt that he taught this through the interpretations of Break On Through from The Doors, or using the visionary tradition inherent in Bob Dylan. He taught us that poetry, philosophy, science, mysticism, and all media were not separate domains, but part of a single living current. This episode in particular speaks to two communities, the educators that are listening and the media ecologists. For educators, BW offers one of the most profound articulations of teaching I've ever encountered. He sees the classroom not as a place for goal orientation, but as a space for what he calls awareness practice. He urges us to practice suspended judgment, to create conditions where the poetic being of a student can emerge. It's a vision of education as presence, perception, community, and profound care. For the media ecology community, this is an intimate and rare portrait of a thinker who has lived at the heart of your tradition. BW shares stories of Marshall and Eric McLuhan, of Northrop Frye, of his time with Pierre, Elliott, Trudeau, and of his lifelong dialogue with the forces shaping consciousness and culture in the electronic age. BW has written 16 books across the fields of poetry, philosophy, criticism, and media. His works include Mystic Trudeau, Towards a Canada of Light, The Charge in the Global Membrane, Marshall McLuhan and Northrop Frye, Apocalypse and Alchemy, and his most recent book, Mysteria. He is also the co-founder of Stream Elsewhere Press and has taught for many years at York University, where his courses on visionary writers, and as he's termed the category, literary ecology, have left an indelible mark on all of his students. Our conversation spans many themes: the electronic cosmos, teaching and learning, writing and reading, the work of James Joyce, Frye, McLuhan, and quite frankly, far too many authors to mention here, the dangers of anti-information, as he's coined the phrase, and the urgent need to cultivate deeper forms of attention in our schools, our politics, and our inner lives. We talk about why BW still writes his books by hand, and why, in a digital culture obsessed with speed, we need to recover slowness, ambiguity, and exploration. B.W. Powe is erudite without ever being cold. He's visionary without ever losing touch. To me, he is a true Renaissance figure and exactly the kind of thinker we need to make visible again to our students, teachers, and the culture at large. This episode, like BW himself, refuses simplification. But I hope our conversation leaves you, as they always do me, with the desire to continue on. To continue into mystery, into presence, and into a deeper way of seeing. So without further ado, here is my conversation with B.W. Powe. B.W. Powe, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
It finds me in the midst of winter with a great scene outside my windows. It looks like it's a wonderful life happening outside. I wanted to begin by saying beginnings are hard and often the most difficult because endings are even harder. So what I would like to suggest is that what we're actually doing, and what I tend to do when I talk about my own work and even when I teach, is begin in the middle, because let's call that in medias res, which is, beginning in the middle. And as you know, all good stories are often begin in the middle. And because it's where the emergence appears, it's where the momentum begins to take hold. So let's begin today in the midst of things rather than an actual beginning. We begin in the middle where we can note, bridge, zigzag, break, fare forward, and plunge on. I'm not very good at starting, and I anticipate and get anxious over ending. So let's go into the middle and say from there we can go charging off in all directions at once. And given that the electronic world enforces, emphasizes, enlarges, and enhances the non-Euclidean space and all at onceness, we can move from the middle and unfold an omnidirectional resonance, as they would say.
Well, I think the audience is already getting, Bruce, a sense of why I wanted you on the podcast. Besides being a dear friend for over 20 years
Long time.
now,
Yeah.
Long time. You've been next to my father, who you know well and have conversed with over the years many times. You've influenced my thinking probably more than anybody else. And anybody that knows me long enough hears me talk about McLuhan and Frye, and that's certainly because of your influence and persistence on those two Canadian thinkers in particular, with a slew of others. I think I have a bit of a challenging task here today because there are two audiences that I want to bring you to. One, the education audience, which this firmly reaches. And two are, let's call the media ecology friends and colleagues, that I want to give them a more intimate look at your work. So before we kick off, maybe this is the truly middle part, or the in medias res, as you described. Can you give the audience a sense of what you're up to and what you're doing now?
Well, I'm in the middle of writing many books, 5 in fact, and following up on Mysteria, which was the most recent publication, and continuing on with the publishing house Stream Elsewhere Press, which I've founded with another former York student, my colleague and co-creator and great friend, Elliott Shepherd. And I should mention that Elliott came to a talk I gave many years ago in at the library in Stouffville after we'd stopped being a teacher-student relationship. And he said, I really want to work with you. I just want to get your work out there, your ideas out there. Wonderful, generous, big-hearted, and inspired thing to say. And we've been working together ever since, including founding this publishing house, Stream Elsewhere Press. So in the midst of teaching as well at York University and my 2 fourth-year classes and some of my working with my graduate students. But, where did the teaching, writing pathways come from? The via negativa and the via positiva, as they call them. The via negativa being the hermetic private route of creation and introspection and inwardness and cultivating reading and study and poetry and poetics. And then the via positiva, which is the communal route, which is the route through teaching, reaching others, inspired together. And one of the things I've done in the last few years, before I sort of go back and look at beginnings, is that I don't really talk about my classes as having a content per se. I talk about it as an awareness practice in which what we do together is study and learn and embrace the works and engage the works not as things to deride or treat with contempt, but what do the voices bring to you in the class? So sometimes I quip to my students, next week we're going to be talking about Emily Dickinson. You may bring her books too, which is that we invite the authors, the writers, the creators into the E-zone, because I'm teaching online these days for various reasons, which I can talk about later. And I don't call them classes anymore. I call them gatherings in which we talk about the work and the alchemy of the work and encourage an awareness practice, which is study, delving, and learning what I would call poetic Aporia, which is really the study of complexity, ambivalence, ambiguity, resonance, the unfinished. But this also all began in my desire to write. And I was, as you know, I was a late comer to teaching at universities in particular, though I came from a teaching family. My mother was a teacher and a piano teacher, and my grandfather on my mother's side was a high school principal. So the other great aspect of the poetic Aporia and conducting an awareness practice with gatherings in which the students become more like apprentices, where we become, not really professor-student relationships, which I think encodes a kind of unnecessary hierarchy. It is really mentor, guide, practitioner, cultivating the artistic inwardness, as it were, of reading. Now, that may sound new agey, but it's not. It's actually very old. It's in the ancient, the archaic way of teaching, which is that the teachers are mentors. They are not some sort of divinely gifted or politically set aside figures who are higher than you are. They are learning from you too. And the greatest learning is always mutual. And what I tell my students is that the practitioners in our rooms together is that our e-rooms, because I teach online, is that we are engaging in a dialogue in the garden of study. And every week we have a few hours to engage one another on a level in which the rest of the world melts away for a time. And we try to appeal to what is the best in the work and the best in ourselves. And one of the things we try to do is practice suspended judgment, which I think is one of the key ways to learn, because we all come in awash with opinions, deluged with what I call anti-information. Well, by the way, for your listeners, and viewers, I'm in a campaign to change the word misinformation to anti-information. Because misinformation can be simply something where you're wrong. You thought the War of 1812 took place in 1814 or something like that. But anti-information is a new phenomenon in which there is this deluge, this roll of virulent and vehement anti-data that is flowing over us, frequently distorting and dislocating our minds and sensibilities to such an extent that all kinds of issues are very much become crises in our time. So the teaching experience for me is somewhat like the writing experience too, because it is the time when we delve, encourage emergence, engage complexity, ambiguity. And here I want to emphasize that all of this is what I call poetic aporia, or the unfinished or poetic being. It's teaching poetics not as an object of study, but as a way of life. So that what we cultivate and preserve is that necessary inwardness and awareness simultaneously, awareness of what's going on in the surround, and the inwardness that is the imagination and the capacity to train perception. Now, you could ask, where did a lot of this come from? Which I assume and presume was your comment about the beginnings. And if I may, for a moment, and since we are in the middle, this requires digression. Sometimes, I hope your listeners and viewers will forgive me. I digress a great deal. It's called jazzing in music. And sometimes I digress to the point where I forget what the topic sentence was and continue on into the digression.
Well, I'm here to bring it back, but you actually just preempted the next question I was going to ask, which is about your beginnings a little bit, because you also mentioned, the teacher-student relationship, this more of a mentoring and learning together piece, which I think you have an incredible.
You can confirm whether that was true in our situation.
As a former student, I remember there was no place to hide in your class. It was an open discussion, and it was wonderful. But you had really great mentors, is what I was getting to here.
Yes, I did.
Really,
I was very lucky.
If I can put it in this mundane way, a kind of hall of fame of mentors, Canadian intellectuals. Can you describe your learning journey? Like, let's actually start, because I think it's also important for folks to know that you were a high school dropout as well.
I was. Yes.
And so I think that's an important context, because we tend to view students that drop out or that are not engaged in schools as not capable, or at least the general public does. And it obviously wasn't the case with you, and you've had this wonderful career as a writer and teacher and thinker. So can you take me back to those days, and then talk about how and who you came across in your learning journey?
I very much appreciate you raising the issue about high school dropout, because I do tell my students at some point they are being taught by a high school dropout. Keep in mind, I was a young person, student in the early 70s, so in the afterburn of the 1960s, and Bob Dylan's like a Rolling Stone. How does it feel to be on your own? It was very much a time of more exploration, experimentation, a willingness to step away from structures and systems that did not serve us. And that I did not drop out of high school because I was a wastrel, because I wanted to wander off in my mind and spirit somewhere. I did because I dropped out in part because I wanted to learn. I wanted to continue to experience things. I'd also had a very protected childhood in many ways, a very warm, protected childhood, a good thing. But I knew that that insulation could conceivably, potentially overprotect my sensibility and conscience. It was an intuition. It wasn't anything as conscious as I'm at that time as I'm making it sound now. So dropping out of high school was in part a very deliberate decision, supported in fact by my family, strangely enough, to go on the road, on the pathway to learning, to delving, and to writing, because I was publishing when I was 16, 17. There was an intuition that all experience is a crossroads, a crux. At every crossroads, the Sphinx arises, and the Sphinx asks questions, and you can ask the Sphinx a question too, which is not always understood as part of the riddle. But that decisive, pivotal, long-lasting, changing moments, abidingly enigmatic moments come to you. And one of them was leaving school. And I was very late comer to the university system too, which actually you know about too, because your father was very much involved in that process. And a somewhat reluctant, uneasy member to this day, not because of students or the experience of teaching, but because institutions frequently have a psychotic side, and they are, as I like to say about many institutions, they're run by Franz Kafka, but minus his sense of humor. They can have an oppressive, limiting feel to it. However, it's also very difficult to live outside the institutions. Emerson has a wonderful phrase in one of his essays where he says, "I am a weed by the wall." It's a beautiful phrase, which is the wall exists, but you are the thing that is growing in the cracks and around it. And that's being in the middle again is the crack, isn't it? It's the interval. It's something that is perpetually opening to other possibilities. So the decisive influences, and you talk about the legacies. One of the reasons I left high school was I also wanted to meet the people that I thought could influence and change me. I was looking for transformation. And I was very lucky in my mother and father, but especially my mother. My father was a writer and a politician and a business person, a very lively, inquiring mind. My mother was an artist, a musician, and a very, very gifted amateur pianist. Amateur means to do something for love, amateur, as opposed to someone who it's their profession. She was introduced me to reading music, trained me in music, how to listen deeply, and to make music not just background but a vibration, a resonance, a momentum, a pulse that would live always with you. And I'm very indebted to my mother's encouragement of the eccentric life. Eccentric means out of the center, out of the sphere, or idiosyncratic life, because she wanted to have an artistic life and couldn't and didn't, and suffered, I must say, great depression and anxiety, and ultimately a great deal of ill health for the thwarting in her spirit and soul. It became a very difficult person for others in many ways, but not to me. And she was fundamental. Her name was Alice, A-L-Y-S, in the Gaelic spelling with her Irish background. She thought very much that one should have an independent, imaginative, creative life. And she was the one who read poetry and talked to me about music, poetry, and art. And first concert I ever went to was an opera with her when I was 5. I saw Don Giovanni. My father was a profound influence, too, in the sense of conversation. He treated all of us as equals around the table. There was no pontificating. There was just conversation. And so there was the sense of the entry into the public sphere with him. If my mother was the hermetic side, the introspective side, my father was the conversational side, the dialogue side. Of course, he had a life in politics, and he was part of the liberal governments. And I had, through him, the great good fortune of meeting 3 or 4 prime ministers when I was young, and then eventually observing the machinations of the Liberal Party, which is another story, through his awareness. The other person I have to acknowledge, too, which I've never done in public before, and I'm taking this opportunity, this rendezvous, this crossroads crux moment that you're sharing with me. Now you've become the mentor and I'm the student, as it were, or the practitioner, engaged in the awareness practice together with you, Jason, is a teacher in high school named Alison Gordon, who was a high school English teacher, and I owe her a great deal. She was a very young woman. She must have been around 26, 27 when I was in high school. She didn't encourage me to drop out. That was not her thing. But she very early on recognized in my writing and sensibility and the way that we talked that there was a different pathway ahead. And she gave me books that were not on the curriculum. For example, T.S. Elliott's Wasteland and 4 Quartets, and Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. And she gave me Wuthering Heights. In homage to Alison Gordon, I still teach all those books, and partly to remind myself that she, as this wonderful muse figure, gave me the openings that I needed in my imagination. And rather than study in the English literature classes, she just gave me permission to go to the library and read, which is where I discovered H.D. and Ezra Pound and Louis Zukofsky and William Carlos Williams and Emily Dickinson, and also Marshall McLuhan, which I read at that time too. Fascinated by him. So by the time I left high school, it was not because of, as I said, trying to waste myself. It was to find a way to live an inspired, imaginative, inventive, alternative life, I guess would be one of the ways that we did that, you would say. I went into university early, actually. I did it in a music audition. And I went to audit a music class and met a man named David Ledove, who was at the music department at York University. And I said, can I audit classes? I was 17, 18. And he said, how old are you? And I told him, and he said, and do you play music? I said, I play guitar. And he said, well, instead of auditing, why don't you audition and enroll? So I said, well, I didn't know you could do that. And he said, yes, you can. And so the pathway suddenly opened in which I enrolled early at York. I applied early, took an exam with seniors. I was the youngest person in the room, and became a music student. And some of my colleagues at York to this day tend to be musicians. And I am sometimes in the music department where I will do exams. I did a wonderful PhD with Sue Foley, one of the great blues guitarists in the world, truly. And she wrote a fantastic PhD thesis on female guitarists. What a wonderful thing to learn about, all the forgotten guitarists who were women. So, but while I was in undergrad school, and I have to emphasize to whoever may be listening in and watching, that I was a very, very erratic student. If I was not interested, I didn't do well. Just simple as that. So if you were to go back and look at my grade sheets, they would be like this. And, but I never had a lot of difficulty with some of my teachers because they knew that wave was a kind of creative wave, that it was on another wavelength. And the legacy of my mother and of Alison Gordon, reading and teaching and writing and listening and writing poetry. I should emphasize that the poetry I wrote as a teenager was dreadful. I was no young Rimbaud or Chatterton or Shelley or Keats, who were all blossoming in their teenage years in their early 20s. I think my poetry writing really didn't come alive until I was in my 30s, which also has a good legacy of people like William Carlos Williams, Milton, and others. But that sense of spirit, of poetics, of recreation over destruction was very deep in me. And I had acknowledged that I didn't have a very good financial sense and a material sense, and there were a lot of years there of financial difficulty. But with some very good teachers at York, they encouraged me to think of graduate school eventually. And here was where another crossroads came about. Was I going to go out on the road and continue to write, which I was doing, or meet some of the mentors that I had found in books? Because books are mentoring too. I don't think all books have a didactic intent, but when you're walking in the garden of a book, as it were, opening the pages, you're opening yourself to new forms of consciousness, expanding your sensibility and awareness to the point where you are climbing that tree of knowledge that is embedded in the garden of study. Hebrew word pardes, by the way, means roughly translates as garden or paradise, but it refers very specifically in the Kabbalah to study, to the importance of constantly encouraging the mind and kindling the mind. And as you know, we're both parents, we both have employment, we have families, we live in a media-saturated environment in which data and misinformation now overwhelms us on a daily basis. Keeping the mind sharp, alive, aware, and practice is very difficult and a great challenge. And it's part of why I encourage students to read, because it creates a counter environment in which they can continue to develop that sensibility and awareness. So at the end of the undergrad year, to put it in a nutshell, I was really wanted to set out, rather than get an MA as a sort of career path, but to meet certain people. And those two people were pivotal. They were Marshall McLuhan and Northrop Frye. And McLuhan was, by that time, at the end of the 70s, had descended into a kind of purgatory. It's very hard to imagine that now, since his name is a word in the dictionary, and the University of Toronto touts his image and reputation everywhere. But at the time in the 70s, there was something that had been reacted against his vision of electronic takeover, as it were, of consciousness, sensibility, and communication fields. I've often said, pardon the repetition, those who've heard this, that to say the medium is the message and that book culture would be displaced or dislocated in 1958, 1960, 62 was heresy, blasphemy, controversial, subversive. To say it in 2025 is to be so trite and obvious that it would take your breath away if anybody said that. It's thinking that it was some kind of Mount Sinai shattering revelation. It is not. But to have said it at that time is an astonishing act of prophecy on his part. And of all the figures that I've met in my life, and there have been quite a number, which we won't be able to list or engage today, but McLuhan remains the most uncanny in terms of, I'm using the word precisely, uncanny, in his prophetic capacity. But I wanted to meet him, and I wanted to have a rendezvous crossroads, as it were, a correspondence moment, as it were, with Frye. And then the third one was Pierre Trudeau, who I saw as mentoring Canada towards a middle way between Europe and the United States. Again, there's that in medias res idea at play, that Canada had a separate destiny to be the middle way, neither entirely European nor entirely North American, something else. So I must say that the nearness of these figures was also something, and I'll use the word as precisely as I can, they were dear to me. And that may sound like I'm sentimentalizing, but actually I'm not, because the word dear means value. It means scarcity. It means something that is rare. The word dear does mean beloved, and it does mean sublime, but it also means something of value that comes from a kind of scarcity that's rare. And I had an intuition that these people were dear, that they were going to be essential not only to my selfish needs of learning and growing and writing and directing that internal momentum towards invention, but also that there was something unique in the fact they were here. They were at the University of Toronto. They were part of a school, which has since been dubbed by Paulo Granada and others the School of Communication. And then not only did I meet Marshall McLuhan, but I met someone who would go on to be a very dear and rare figure in my life, who was Eric McLuhan, Marshall's son, the person I like to disagree with the most in my life. Rare quality in many of these people that they seldom took disagreements personally. I must say I'm not like that, and I wish I could be, but I go with the Godfather view that it's all personal one way or another. But it is, they were not like that, and you could have wonderful disagreements with you, and they would take that as part of the peduma, the eudaimonia, the flourishing, the learning, the practice, the deepening of complexity, of the poetic aporia, as I've been referring to it. So I did not actually formally enroll in Northrop Frye's class. I audited that class, but I was there with McLuhan in the last class he gave, which was 6 people and a part of the fabled 6 as it's become. And that pathway taught me to be observant about the effects of media and what they were doing, and how the environment was changing into a technological environment. It already had, it wasn't, but it was continuing on that trajectory of radical change, and that a new consciousness, a new sensibility was emerging in the 20th, 21st century that was rooted in technological invention and creation, and that the surround of our environment, in our environment of communications, electronics, and of technologies would decisively alter us, and that we would become new beings, as it were. With Frye, it was the cultivation of inwardness, which was in a time that was darkening, one needed to find the inspiration of the imagination, of understanding metaphor, of understanding and reading complexity and ambiguities of powerful words, to see emergent multiple worlds as a form of consciousness altering. You don't need LSD when you have Poetry. It is the drug that alters you, as it were. It is if you want to put it that way, the depths, complexity, the simultaneity of reading, which is that all things are now. Blake's great idea that the poet, reader, seer lives in the past, present, and future, that the imagination is always now. That combined with McLuhan's idea that technology emphasizes, enhances, and distorts the now, so that you are always in an immediacy, an instantaneousness, a multiplicity of convergence of communication signals and sound, that the individual can be overwhelmed by this anti-information deluge. The new consciousness can be as much enlightened as distorted and malformed, as we have been seeing all too much since the sort of post-utopian phase of the internet is now beginning to dawn on us more. But part of what those mentors brought to me, and the crossroads with them, these benign sphinxes, as it were, was the energy and necessity of an idea. Ideas in Blakean terms, William Blake's terms, are contraries. They are this and that simultaneously. This is not either or. They are influences and complementary energies that allow paradox, complexity, ambiguity, and the capacity of the mind to create fables and myths to endure and prevail. A dynamic fusion of perception and conception. So that's what I really took from them. And you talk about going out on your own. Marshall McLuhan, with our class of 6, was wonderful at just meeting and talking to you. You know, if you wanted to have office hours with him, you could. You just say, I'm going to be here. And he would show up, frequently coming from a meeting at IBM or something where he was being paid a lot of money to come and talk to you. And it was very much that one-on-one quality with him. It's something I try to maintain with my own apprentices and practitioners in our awareness practice. And I told him I was not going to go on to do my PhD, that I was going to go out and continue to write because I was already publishing. And he said, well, Mr. Powe, he never did know my first name. That is a very dangerous route to take. Now, that's about the best thing you could tell a 24-year-old, that it's dangerous, because it just sounded like the most exciting, thrilling, demanding roller coaster adventure quest you could have. I didn't know he meant that it could be difficult to have 3 meals a day, but I took it to understand that it was the learning route. I must say, too, that the McLuhan family became very good friends after I graduated, and not only Eric, Marshall's oldest son, but all the children in many ways. And especially Corin McLuhan, who I also owe a great deal to, because she maintained our friendship long after Marshall passed away, and was very encouraging, inspiring, and supportive. I never got to know Frye that well, but part of the reason for that is that his wife Helen was afflicted with Alzheimer's at the time and was very ill, and he was increasingly deaf and a bit withdrawn. But to my delight, I met him some years later at a gathering that Barrett Callahan had hosted, and I don't like social literary occasions very much, but it was one I did attend. And Frye was there, and my first books had been published, and we chatted. There's a photo of us talking, actually, in John Ayre's biography of Frye. And to my surprise and delight, he knew my first books. And even though that I had been quite critical of some of what he'd said in one of them, to say the least, he was very receptive and very encouraging, and very much saw the direction. One, keep in mind too that Frye was not a professional scholar in the way many are now. He never had his PhD. He was hired at a time when books were enough, and his first book, Fearful Symmetry, was 1946, was really the springboard for being hired. And then after that, it was really the third member of that Canadian triumvirate was to meet Pierre Trudeau and talk to him. I suppose an intellectual groupie, someone might say. But it was, to be more charitable than that, it was much more to see these legacy figures, these figures that were mentoring the spirit in our supposedly frozen country. And the nearness of their ideas taught me a great deal about the dearness of those ideas, the value, and why one would have a life inspired, moved, engulfed, immersed, absorbed by ideas. So if I were to say anything about all those people, from my mother to Alison Gordon to the three legacy figures, it would be to thank you for letting me never be the same, because that is what they brought. I still believe we are working out Pierre Trudeau's vision of Canada, whether pro or contra, one way or another. Harper and other prime ministers made it very much their intention to undo that legacy, but it is a respect for the legacy to want to go against it. That is, it's challenging it, but still very much Canada is struggling to find its way now, especially with that idea of the third way and the counter nation that is not defined by tribe or radical affiliations with previous cultures, but a new kind of society as well, but not rooted in revolution, but in metamorphosis and transformation. And a profound contrast to the increasingly violent and divisive United States, which is in a terrible place at the moment. And that dynamic fusion of perception and conception is what I tried to take into teaching as well. Did all those five figures, my father included, so 6, and others over the years, leave one lasting imprint? I think it was to educate yourself constantly, to be training the mind, practicing, no matter how tired you get, to try and counter the dullness, fatigue, unimaginative, overwhelming anti-information environments by the poetics of gatherings in which the awareness practice is continued one way or another. I often like to say that you're part of this, Jason, is that that it is the unwritten school, the unknown school, which is it does not have a location. It's what we carry in our hearts and minds, that nearness. And in that dearness of the depths in which poetics is not an object of study, but a way of life. And that's what led me to my books. My first books were published in my 20s, and then beyond that into now. And I think I'm coming up to my 16th or 17th. I'm kind of lost track.
So following that line, Bruce, I know one of the books that, I really admire is Toward a Canada of Light, that you seem to be constantly rewriting and reworking.
Yes, there are 3 different versions of it.
Can you describe your view of Canada's kind of distinctive visionary tradition in literature and how it should shape or could shape our cultural identity?
It's a big question, and one of the things that I try to emphasize in the gatherings and in the symposia of learning together and in discussions with others, Canada as a kind of counter state, an emergent state in which we were not founded by revolutionary principles, but by principles of emergence, really, which is or evolution, if you wish. Why did the 3 different versions of a Canada of Light? Well, Eric McLuhan charmingly once said it's because you didn't get it right the first time. You keep trying to do it again. And eventually I gave up because I couldn't get it right. Also, I guess, given the unfinished nature of the subject matter, it keeps the idea that it is the counter nation is in constant process, though all societies are, but we are not an empire. And we are at the side, as it were, of the great American experiment and violent extension as it is at the moment. The other thing I would say too is that, and this is perhaps somewhat arcane, to me, Canada is, as the First Nations would say, it is a gathering point and also an imaginative place, an imaginary place. It's what you carry in yourself to invent, create a place where there is so much unfinished, unmade, so much space, as it were, around us, imaginative space, that we have the potential, the convergence point to allow the imagination to continue its work of alchemy. Sometimes, to put this more concretely, think of the fact that 2 of our greatest filmmakers are Denis Villeneuve with the Dune movies and Arrival and the Blade Runner sequel, and James Cameron with his Avatar legacies. Directors of unparalleled scale. And it's as if the great tundra, wilderness, frontier, winterscapes of Canada have created spaces that must be charged, recharged, filled, and reshaped by this grand scale in their work. However, that said, that there are no margins in the technosphere. We talk sometimes about Canada being a marginal space. I don't think that metaphor works anymore, given the acoustic electro experience of the sort of the technological cocoon. We are all involved in that. Are there margins? There can't be when everything is a sphere. It has to have squares in it, and spheres do not have margins. But we can see, just as I started today, that there are all scripts become bridges, and we're always in the middle. And Canada actually being physically in the middle between so many societies and states allows us to have preserve a sort of openness and an opening for the possibility of what a democracy could still be. Whitman, quoting a great American poet, talked about poetry being the primeval democratic spirit, which is that all of us can speak this. All of us can do this. I suggested to you once, Jason, that what we should really be doing at schools, instead of giving degrees in this and that, but degrees in decoding, degrees in schools of communication, imagination, creativity, and perception, how to decode what's going on around you. Plunging enrollments in humanities and English should tell us that something is going on that's not just changing, but asking us for a different kind of approach to what we do. The other thing, too, is the teaching of poetics and the writing of that poetic being in the books has pushed my books more and more towards a more, I think, elliptical and mixed modes approach, taking from the older ones, which are working in a more Euclidean space, to one in which the time-space is non-Euclidean, more vertical and horizontal, more demanding on the reader in terms of that poetic aporia, complexity, ambiguity, so that the cracks in the works are meant to be inspirational. That is, they're literally to inspire, to enthuse, to perhaps even bewilder, but bewilderment and confusion can be forms of, can be turning points. What is it that's being said here? Let me put it another way. There's a virtue in being incoherent if you're genuinely exploring what makes you think you're going to be saying something that everyone else has said, and also what makes you think that everything is ready to be said. Coherence is often a sign that you are saying what's already been said. How's that for a defense of something that people have said over the years?
Well, let me see if I can.
Books are incoherent.
Well, let me see if I can get you to articulate that in a slightly different way. So your writings invoke mysticism, spiritual longing, certainly a visionary consciousness, something that I think many modern readers don't fully understand or appreciate. So what tradition would you situate your work? How can we give them some footholds, as it were, to understand what you're doing?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer in many ways, because there are more responses and replies than there are succinct answers. That there is a hermetic, solitary side to the work, which comes from that cultivation of inwardness and demands quite a bit out of the reader to participate by sharing their inwardness, one reader's voice, mind, merging and engaging the mind presence that's in the work. There's also that hermetic side is also a part of an attempt to appeal to that hermetic side in the reader too, which is because reading is so much of a challenge now, and reading online is different from reading a book. The metaphor of opening a book: open the book and you open yourself. Turn the page and you turn a form of your consciousness to another page. reading from left to right is actually going from morning to night. And then when you finish the book, you are actually back at the morning, as it were. These are the archaic Kabbalic lessons of reading, that reading is not just passive entertainment or delight or escape, it's transformation. And it's following the pattern of awakening and sleep. And James Joyce, of course, embodied that in his Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, where one book is the day-night book and the other book is the sleep book, the dream book. The language is spoken in dreams. So that reading can be difficult. And I emphasize that, back to the question about where I started from and what I learned and the teachers that I had and the mentors and guides and people who directed things, they always seemed to speak in ways that were enigmatic and difficult. And it seems to me the third wave for Canada is difficult. The most intelligent thing would probably be to join the United States, because we'd have lower taxes and all sorts of other things. We'd have guns and all kinds of other problems. But that's not the real question. The real question is difference, alternative space, preserving democratic inwardness, as it were, independence, not just individuality, is an internal state, not just a political state. The point being that the enigmas in the book reflect what I see more and more as the difficulties and the enigmas around us. And I would simplify the works if I knew how to do that. And in many ways, they are enigmatic and difficult because many of my own mentors and guides were difficult. They saw the difficult roots, the via negativa, not to be understood as the negative root, that is the root of no. It is the hermetic, inward, more complex root in some ways, was to challenge you towards saying and doing the difficult things. That's why we started in the middle today, isn't it? Because it's really the difficult place.
So, Bruce, in this world of anti-information, you feel that, and this might be difficult to answer for all of society, but you feel like we're losing the exploration of the complex? You feel that we're looking for simple answers in increasingly complex times?
Information, anti-information overload, the deluge of data creates a hunger for reductiveness, and for finding the most productive answers. Simple answers, that's a different thing. The simplicity is hard to achieve. The condition of complete simplicity costs not less than everything. That's T.S. Elliot's famous paradox about simplicity, is that everything has to go into being saying something simply. But that's different from the reductiveness that you were speaking about. And many of the political movements of our time are nostalgic for something that never existed to begin with. But there's also an attempt to find a kind of emblazoned either or, things are this way and not that way. And yet that's why I've been emphasizing all along in our conversation today, and I do in the awareness practice teaching and in my books, trying to encourage the awareness and attentiveness, that counter-utilitarian freeing of the mind and spirit in the work to roam and venture, to go in fear of certainty and goal orientation. I mean, my goodness, you hear so much teaching is about goal orientation. I have never known what my goals were. They were actually about those crossroads rendezvous moments, those encounters, engagements with enigmas and ideas were not goals. They were, I suppose you could say, roles. What were you going to be in those moments? So, encouraging daydreams and drifts. I don't know about you as a student before we encountered one another, but I was a terrible daydreamer in my classes. And I did not discover until much later that reverie, which is one of the highest poetic states, is in fact a kind of daydream, oniric drift state in which you allow creativity to flow. But it's not always encouraged because we are the imperative of goals, of getting somewhere. which is important. And how do you explain to your parents you're taking a literary degree when transparently it's going to lead to something that is not necessarily economically viable? But it is at the same time necessary for invention, imagination, creativity, and to find those reverie states in which something new may come. How many ideas changed us in the last 100, 200 years? Very few when you really think of it. From Marx to Darwin, to Einstein, to the inventors of the computer, etc. There are very few ideas that transformed everything, but they were new ideas, and making it new, as H.D. Hilda Doolittle said, is not just to make it now, but to allow that possibility of the free mind and spirit to come into play so that invention moves with you. Now, we're in a very dark phase, so I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about this, because I know that one of the desperations of our time is the collapse of new ideas, and that what we're getting is recycled tyranny, authoritarian politics, reductive ideas about religion, to the point where literalizing religious texts has become again a kind of overt assertion of power. And why? Because people are confused and lost and overwhelmed, and anti-information is roiling us to the extent that choice becomes frightening. And we are at a vertigo of something, at a point in which the rendezvous we're all in, the crossroads we're all in, is one in which the new is overwhelming us. So again, that awareness practice that I try to encourage during those moments when, in the symposia of learning together and reading together, one of the things in those symposia, those gatherings, that I encourage is that we just read together. Sometimes we just open a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson and just start reading. And what do you see? What do you sense? What's around? And don't reduce it to saying she was this or that, but to what is imploding in the words and exploding in your imagination. Now, if you're asking back to that question about the envisioning of a Canada as a Canada of light, it was the idea that politics could still command a discussion of what the good society is. Right now, I think we're looking at it that citizens have become taxpayers, and we're looking at an entirely different paradigm that is being enforced by the kind of economic mentality of many of the people who attempt to rule us. But citizenship is that beautiful and sometimes complex, challenging engagement with thinking of ourselves beyond malice, cruelty, assertion, aggression, and victory over every other thought. So that we have something in which go beyond the winners and losers mentality to participate in the fatal flaw of being human, which is the complexity of being here. When I say fatal flaw, I'm meaning that to deliberately exaggerate the point that the good society will only come about if we recognize our mutual flaws, not who's going to win over somebody else. So I still see that all those figures that we talked about at the beginning of why I began with my mother encouraging listening to music and training, and the high school teacher pointing to go to the library and read, and then seeking out these mentors and guides, was a kind of counter-utilitarian view of what is the good life. And for me, it was invention, imagination, creation, and poetic being. One of the books I want to write, and I've been gathering notes for years, is on poetic being. One of the idea that searing is reading at the same time, that seeing into things, delving, is encouraging us to recognize our multiple selves, our many, the crossroads we carry within in the heart, and that poets are not there because they're pure, unflawed beings. They are somehow free of complexity. On the contrary, it is the complexity reminds us that we participate in the good when we see that there are the flaws in all of us.
So what I think about, Bruce, is how do we attempt to go against the tide? You know, you have a number of educators here. You have a number of folks that, by and large, are connected to education, even in the media ecology group. Maybe this is a question about teachers, but I can frame it a bit differently as well in terms of the role of the public intellectual. What do you see the role of teachers or public intellectuals like today in this kind of society that we live in that prioritizes, you know, quick clicks and likes and shallow exploration,
and the primarily utilitarian view of learning, which education, which is that it's the goal is a job, rather than a way of being in the life in the world. It becomes the goal is a job, and while that should not be underestimated, and eating 3 meals a day is an important thing, it is, and shelter and all these things that are important to us in an increasingly stratified and expensive society, which limits choice, doesn't expand choice. I think of teaching and writing as being one thing. I didn't at one time. And I must say that when I began writing my books, which was, and publishing, which 17, 18, and in my years old and in my 20s, it was because I saw writing as a sort of separate activity from educational systems. But it was very difficult to survive as a writer and almost impossible. And so I took on teaching and was offered positions and took them on contract basis. And eventually the teaching and the writing began to merge in my mind as one creative endeavor. Now, what to say to teachers and mentors? Don't forget that we are mentoring each other and that teaching is not a top-down affair. It has to be an affair of generosity and engagement with the spirits of the people who are in the room with you in order to encourage them. And that can be very difficult, particularly when there's epic distraction going on and when there is a soft addiction to computer screens, et cetera, et cetera. The role of the screen in teaching is underestimated and hasn't been fully explored yet as to what this may be doing to consciousness, awareness, sensitivity, sensibility. So there are two approaches that I take. One is, as you mentioned right at the beginning, participating in media ecology, which is the awareness of technological surround. What is happening to our sensibilities, our capacity to attend to things, to remember, and to be literate in this environment in which anti-information roils us at an extraordinary speed, faster each day.
And I caught, Bruce, at your last talk, a great practice that I think is worth sharing with folks, because I struggle to journal about myself. But you gave a great idea of a media ecology journal, journaling about your experience in media. Can you
the
describe
awareness
that?
practice?
I think that's useful at this point.
Well, to study the words around you. What are the new words of the day? What are the buzzwords? Bait click, I understand, or hate click are the two words that have become very popular. But it's important to know what those terms suggest. They carry detonations of association. They're all sort of a surround, a kind of, they're nodes in which a great deal of popular consciousness is compressed. And you need to look at the terms and words and what are people saying and what are they not saying to each other, or study the environment. It can be controversial. For example, one of the exercises I give to practice in my media studies class is note the use of the iPhone or the cell phone at dinner table conversations, or how much is the television always on in certain environments? What does it do? How does it change, like a pub atmosphere, etc.? And there are good aspects of that, communality and connectivity and being able to reach around the world. My wife is an immigrant to Canada, Spanish. She stays in touch with her family in part by the e-connectedness and the e-cosmos. But then there's the other side of that, I'm sure you've already been participated in moments when everybody is more or less mesmerized by the screen and not talking to one another. So to be aware of the ecological impact of the technological sphere, if a tree branch falls on you, that's the natural world, and you're hurt, everyone says, ouch. But if the electronic beam permeates your room to such an extent that you cannot break that mesmerism, somehow or other, people don't see the screen as having an effect. That, oh, it's just ground. It's just environmental. It's just part of our lives. The awareness practice takes us to not ending this, because I don't think there is an ending to it. There is just being aware of what it does, of the processing. Being aware of the environment and the richness of its possibilities, but also the anti-information royal. The other aspect of this is by writing things out by hand, you continue your awareness practice by connecting with your physical body, as it were, and learn the touch memory that musicians will speak about. And as a musician myself, I can say that that's when you go to sit down to play the guitar, frequently your hand knows something your mind doesn't. Your mind does not remember the patterns, but your hand does. But I encourage in our symposia discussions, engagements, dialogues, literary ecology. That's a phrase I've invented, which is to recalling and restoring and restating the process of reading itself. Because people have difficulty reading, and I don't mean difficulty in a good way. I mean the comprehension, apprehension, and patience and time. To encourage us to think of that poetic being that comes about from restoring to us reading time, book time, or as I encourage my students to think of themselves as the analog rebels in the digital consciousness realm. Literary ecology suggests that we need to retrieve alphabetic awareness so that it isn't buried under the deluge of anti-information. Read, because it delves and depths speak to other depths. And that via Negativa, which is the Hermetic route, and the via Positiva can turn into, which is the communal route of learning together, is the via contemplation, or as it were, in which the road of awareness, the road of perception. Now, are these the harder roads to take? Without question, they are. But you referred earlier, Jason, to what were the things that inspired and provoked, especially provoked that momentum to move outside of regular patterns, as it were, and find things. It was not only to live an inspired life, a life of enthusiasm. Entheos means to be filled. Inspiritus, inspiration, means to welcome the spirit in whatever way it appears. But it was also to see, to perceive as much as possible in my obviously limited way. There are only so much that each of us can see or are given time to see. That's why I emphasize, by the way, those who are teachers, that when you're in the learning with your students, that it's a practice you do together and they are teaching you. That's easy to say, but it's true. It's light through, not light on. If you're just telling them what to think, they will always remember that somebody else will be telling them what to do instead of learning that from themselves. It's also, by the way, to leap to the books. The last 3 books I've written don't have page numbers. This has caused consternation with some, but it is a return to samizdat, which is the old Soviet word, Russian word for the underground culture, the undercurrents, in which, again, there are no margins in the technosphere, but there are undercurrents, in which the samizdat is handing the manuscripts from person to person, starting in any direction in the middle, allowing you to flow and move in directions that are not guided by conventional typographic shaping. And that it's a recovering of complexity in the face of sensory overwhelm. The sensory overwhelm is not the same as complexity. What you were saying earlier about the desire for bromides and reduction is a sign of overstimulation. That's not complexity. Complexity is the dynamic emergent forms in which you recognize that maps are always provisional. That's the harder route. But in the end, surely one says to the others, you look back over those valleys and pits and mapless terrains and say, well, at least you tried. At least you tried to go through them. And the searing into the unknown will bring great risks, and one should never underestimate that. And the great American poet Louise Gluck, who won the Nobel Prize some years ago, passed away recently too, wonderful poet, said that the writing of poetry should be likened to feeling being pursued down the street, being chased by someone with a knife in their hands who's trying to fill you with holes. And there is sometimes a risk involved in this, especially if you want to sit around the dining table and point out to everybody that they're on iPhones and not talking to one another. You know, you're running the risk of breaking the mesmerism and having everybody very angry and annoyed.
Yeah.
By the way, back just to as it's coming to me in the middle, improvising, that hermetic and public element that you likened to, I sometimes think in myself is a complementary pattern of the Dickinson-Blake vision of things. Blake wanted a mission in public. He never accomplished it. He was unknown in his own time, outside of a small circle of friends who encouraged his work. But he envisioned the poet as having a vocation of the mission to transform his time and place. Dickinson was inward and private, hermetic, and barely left her room. Her room is famous for a certain slant of light, probably the most famous window in literary history. But that complementarity plays itself out, I know, inside me and in many figures that I've known in my life. I can see it in my mother playing the piano by herself, alone, and playing Chopin and Schumann, sometimes quite well, but not particularly wanting to be a public figure about it, but she could play it. And I see it also in the fact that one of our primary figures in Canadian political history, Pierre Trudeau, was a deeply private, solitary person who, in a rather strange, paradoxical, quixotic way, we knew and didn't know at all. You know, he was very much an interiorized person, and partly because of his reading and writing and his love of poetry, but at the same time also fully engaged with transforming Canada towards a vision that he thought was right. By the way, I want to add that I held at one point, helped to organize a conference on Trudeau in 2000, or 1999, sorry. And at that conference, there were a great number of former Conservative cabinet ministers who showed up from the Joe Clark government days. And I knew of them to see them. And I said, why are you here? You know, of all people. And they said, oh, we love Pierre. And I said, why? You know, because they said, well, first of all, they said he had a vision of Canada, which we didn't agree with, but it was a vision. And said it was perfectly intelligible, and it was very much that Canada was dear to him. It was an idea as well. And they said, so you had to respect that, even if you disagreed, because it gave you something to disagree with. And then the other thing they said was, boy, did you have to be on your toes to disagree with him. Because he would be so quick and encourage debate and conversation. And a person who, by the way, never took things very personally. And so there was this understanding that there was, I hate to use the word authenticity because it's a very complicated word, really. But there was a devotion to that idea that did not transform into a rigid ideology. It transformed into something that was made something in us understand that there were possibilities, transformative possibilities. One of my favorite McLuhan aphorisms is transformation, not transportation. It's haunted me since I heard him utter it in class. And the other thing that has haunted me, and I consider my work a footnote to, is this remark. It never had been written down in the books. in the electronic age, we are living entirely by music. I sometimes wonder whether I hallucinated that moment because nobody can confirm that he actually said it. But everything I have done is a footnote to that line.
Well, it certainly harkens to the work of Murray Schafer, and I know you knew Murray Schafer as well.
Another friend, yes, and another mentor.
Tradition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Murray Schafer once did me an enormous favor. Once we were walking and talking together in Banff in the mountains at the invitation of my great friend, composer, and teacher, Michael Century. And Murray was with his parka over his head and smoking a pipe, and it was cold. But we went up to wander into the hills and listen to the coyotes. And he said, I said something about something, because I think my Solitary Outlaw had just been published. And he said, I said it had some very bad reviews from some people. And he said, took his pipe out, and all I could see was the steam and smoke pouring out. And he said, BW, what they say doesn't matter. What matters is what you've said. And that is left with me ever since. By the way, when we were walking, we could hear the coyotes howling. It was a very cold winter. And I said, what are they doing? And he said, what are they saying? What are they singing? And his response was, well, they're singing to each other. They're just expressing delight that they're out in the wilderness communicating to one another. And to me, that has always been one of the most beautiful images of Canada. Here we are in the wilderness communicating with each other, howling and crying and calling and summoning and speaking and reciting.
So, Bruce, you and I were, just before we hit record, talking about how this could very well be a series of conversations we have, because I had the sense that we would give the audience, obviously, a sense of your fascinating life, the folks that you've met and that have influenced you, and your view into teaching, as well as into your more recent works, in particular Mysteria. But this might be an opportunity to give you a chance to talk about where you see hope. What does it look like to you, both personally and poetically, in the current moment? And I think that might be a good connection to Mysteria, and we can end maybe by talking a little bit about that work and your upcoming talk at York University.
I'd like to also preface that in being in the middle, as it were, again, by saying that Mysteria was surrounded by the pandemic and the period of isolation. It came out of that time of withdrawal and isolation and forced seclusion. And in Spain, my wife is Spanish, and one of the gifts of our life together has been Spain, has been for me, and the great imaginative space of Spain. I was invited to speak at the University of Catalonia in Barcelona, and that's how I went there. And I worked on The Charge and some of the other books that came out after that time, and my McLuhan Frye book at that time. I was given the great opportunity there to work and write and talk to international students, a great privilege, I know. And that north-south combination, which some people have written about in the latest books, is very present in Mysteria as both enforced, which was we were forced to live at that time in that environment, but also the difference between cultures, which some, by being an outsider to that culture, it illuminated certain things, and by being having that culture as illuminating some of what I know about here, and about the difference in the frontier and wilderness that we carry as a legacy in Canada. I'm not talking about the tundra. I'm talking about within, that we carry the wilderness within. And in the cosmos itself is a kind of wilderness, a frontier. We're still struggling with trying to understand what that is. Mysteria came out of a time of intense inwardness, in which the crossroads was the pandemic and isolation, and also engagement with mortality, as my mother and my father became ill, and so many people that I knew and loved and were dear to me were passing away. Sometimes my old friend Jason, I'm former member of our symposia together, and now very much a teacher and mentor yourself. I make a list of the people who have passed in the last in my life in the year, and the list gets too long. And then eventually I feel like I've got to stop, because it's an overwhelming number of passings. And that was part of the Mysteria as well, which was to acknowledge passing and transience, and to leave it open-ended with no page numbers, as it were, and no sort of through direction except for storytelling, but also to acknowledge that the contagion, pandemic, isolation phase in our life is a decisive metamorphic moment, that we are not out of this. The First Nations elders often talk about how the contagion mentality is still with us. The fear of infection, the fear of being isolated, the fact that isolation turned us into e-junkies. That is, we are now always on, whatever was implicit before is now completely explicit. And it's also brought out the techno-utopians and the techno-dystopians, who are something I would love to talk about in another podcast. Now, the question of hope is a very interesting one to me, because it came up in a discussion we had recently at another occasion when Mysteria was launched along with another book. And I must say that I have meditated a great deal on this, and there is a small section at the end of the charge that is a kind of homage to the idea of hope via a philosopher, writer, thinker that I admire very much, is Simone Weil, who wrote in fragments, bits, and was afflicted with the 20th century in a way that I think reminds us that affliction is also a source of wonder, but it's also to put the self and soul on the line in those crossroads moments. And the imperative of doing that is a part of poetic being, as she so ably, so wondrously speaks in compressed, condensed ways. But I have to say that my reflections on the nature of hope are piecemeal, fragmentary, hesitant, and I suppose enigmatic, because you don't have to talk about hope if we live hope. You just are that way. So why is there this hunger, this craving for statements about hope? And in this recent conversation I had at the UT, which my great friend Paulo Granada hosted, that came up. And I didn't say anything directly about it, because there was this question about were McLuhan and Frye and others figures of hope, with my mother, who was afflicted with arthritis and early onset of dementia. Did they talk about hope? The interesting thing is, McLuhan is a devout Catholic, Frye as a devoted literary person and a United Church minister, and they never mentioned the word. And I've thought about this ever since that question came up. And I thought, okay, now why did they not mention the word? And I don't in my classes. The first thing is that I'm very much against prescriptions. The idea that you can have a self-help prescription and say, take 5 of these and you'll be more hopeful tomorrow. That kind of thing. It seems to me that the only reply is manifestation, which is to be here with you. That instead of talking about it, you are it as much as you can be. And the pursuit of poetics, enthusiasm, alchemy, transformation, the greening or viriditis in Hildegard von Bingen's phrase, against desolation, horror, anti-information, that's an action, not a bromide or a maxim. And that trying to transform classrooms into symposia and gatherings in which we're not teacher-student, we're practitioner-apprentice, and that relationship. Sometimes I'm the apprentice, and sometimes they're the mentor, and sometimes they're the mentor, I'm the mentor, and they're the apprentice. That is a translation or transformation of making the crossroads, the enigmatic moments of complexity and drift, manifesting that process rather than go out there and be hopeful. And I think that And this is a recent thought. That's why I like talking about being in the middle, because there are things that I know that I might have said in an answer to that years ago that I would not say now. And I love Oscar Wilde's remark about someone saying, "What's your next book going to be about?" And he said, "A complete contradiction of the last one that I wrote." And in many ways, I feel that too. That the books do not cohere in a systematic Euclidean way. They are divergences, brief crossroads convergences. They break, they go into different directions. The new books, in fact, the new one, A Book of Lost Titles, will actually fall apart in your hands. And then I'll go back into my book on James and Lucia Joyce and the relationship between madness and creativity. We'll go back to a more conventional structure with page numbers. But the embodiment of hope seems to me to be more principled and urgent than speaking about it.
Well, I actually think, Bruce,
does that make sense to you, Jason?
Well, it's actually a wonderful way, I think, to wrap up this discussion, which I still feel is in the middle, and talk about the next manifestation of hope, where we'll be together at York University.
On February the 4th, 2026, 7 p.m. at the Scott Library, second floor, we will be launching Mysteria. And those who can come will get to meet the team that produced Stream Elsewhere Press, including Michael Mayhew, who wrote the soundtrack for the Mysteria. Michael Coughlin, who's a composer, will be bringing some music for Mysteria. 7 p.m. it's open, and I must say York University Library and Bookstore have been in a wonderful institutional supports for my work and for those of us who are trying to think along different lines. And so yes, all are welcome, invited, and the hopefulness is in the showing up, isn't it?
Agreed, and that's why I thought this is a perfect way to end it. B.W. Powe, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully this is maybe even just the beginning.
I would hope so too. And our beginning is our middle.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.